A giant Apache found an injured Comanche girl in his barn, and what he did next shocked everyone. Snow howls across the valley. A towering rancher lights his lantern and sees her lying broken in the straw. He knows one choice could cost him everything: turn her away, and she dies. Bring her inside, and the whole town will turn against him. But when he lifts her into the firelight, a secret is revealed. She isn't just a wounded girl, she carries a treaty that could save her peoples, land and water, or spark a war that will burn the valley down. Now whispers spread in the church pews. Ranch hands load their rifles, and one ruthless cattleman swears he'll destroy them both before the truth comes out. What will this Apache do when mercy collides with danger? Will he risk his home, his family, and his very life? For a girl the world says he should have left to die. Your reactions reaffirm something simple, yet powerful, that stories still shape us, even in silence. If you believe in the soft endurance of love, truth, and doing what's right, then you're exactly why these stories exist. The winter storm howled across the Colorado highlands like a hungry wolf, rattling the shutters of Dakota's cabin. Snow pelted against the windows in waves of white while inside. The Apache rancher methodically fed logs into his pot-bellied stove. The familiar motions brought little comfort on this bitter evening. The fire's warmth couldn't chase away the hollow feeling that had taken root in his chest since Sarah's passing 3 winters ago. His late wife had filled their home with hymns and the scent of fresh bread. Now there was only the crack of burning wood and the endless moan of the wind. Dakota's broad shoulders tensed at a sound that didn't belong. A faint scratching from the direction of his barn. He set down the poker and listened hard. There it was again, barely audible above the storm's fury. Might be a coyote, he muttered to himself, but duty tugged at him. If one of his horses was in trouble, he couldn't leave it until morning. He pulled on his heavy coat, lit a brass lantern, and stepped out into the tempest. The wind nearly knocked him sideways as he pushed through knee-deep snow toward the barn. His boots left deep tracks that filled almost immediately behind him. The barn door creaked as he shouldered it open. Lantern lights swept across familiar shapes: stacked hay bales, tools hanging on pegs, his 2 horses shifting restlessly in their stalls. Then the beam caught something else, a crumpled form half buried in the straw. Dakota approached cautiously, holding the light higher, his breath caught in his throat. A young woman lay curled on her side, her dark hair dusted with hay. Her clothes marked her as Comanche, but what seized his attention was the dark stain spreading across her buckskin dress. She stirred at his approach, eyes fluttering open. Though barely conscious, fear and defiance blazed in her gaze. Her hand moved weakly toward a knife at her belt. Dakota set the lantern down slowly. "Easy now," he said in his deep, quiet voice. "I mean no harm." The girl tried to push herself up but fell back with a whimper of pain. Fresh blood welled from a nasty gash along her ribs. For a long moment, Dakota stood frozen in indecision. The smart choice would be to send her on her way. The local ranchers already viewed him with suspicion. An Apache who kept to himself, who wouldn't drink in their saloons or attend their church socials. Harboring a wounded Comanche would only feed their prejudice. But as he watched her shiver in the straw, Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, "The Lord sends strangers to test our hearts." The girl's eyes were starting to close again. If he left her here, she wouldn't survive the night. Dakota removed his coat and knelt beside her. "I'm going to help you," he said, though he wasn't sure she could understand English. "You'll freeze out here." She flinched when he wrapped the coat around her, but she was too weak to resist as he gathered her carefully in his arms. She felt as light as a child, though he guessed her to be around 20 years old. The trip back to the cabin was a battle against the wind. Snow stung his face and worked its way down his neck, but Dakota pressed on, shielding his burden as best he could. Inside, he laid her gently on a blanket near the stove. In the better light, he could see how pale she'd become. Her skin had an alarming grayish cast beneath its natural copper tone. Moving quickly now, Dakota put water on to heat and gathered clean cloths and what few medical supplies he kept on hand: witch hazel, bandages, and a jar of Sarah's old healing salve that he'd been too sentimental to throw away. The girl watched his every movement through half-closed eyes. When he knelt beside her with warm water and cloth, she managed to whisper something in Comanche. "Don't speak your language," Dakota said quietly. "But I need to tend that wound." She drew a shaky breath and switched to heavily accented English. "My name, Noya. I am Dakota." He showed her the cloth. "This will hurt, but the bleeding must be stopped." Noya gave a slight nod, then gritted her teeth as he began cleaning around the wound. It was a deep cut, probably from a knife, but mercifully clean. As he worked, he found himself humming one of Sarah's hymns, more for his own comfort than his patient's. The familiar melody steadied his hands as he applied the healing salve and bound the wound with strips of clean cloth. By the time he finished, Noya had fallen into an exhausted sleep. Dakota sat back on his heels, suddenly aware of how completely this stranger had disrupted his solitary existence. What would he do with her once she recovered? How would he explain her presence if any of his neighbors came calling? The wind rattled the windows again, as if mocking his concerns. For now, there was only this moment, this choice between mercy and self-preservation. He had chosen mercy, though he couldn't say exactly why. Perhaps it was Sarah's memory, or perhaps something in Noya's fierce dignity spoke to his own lonely heart. He added more wood to the stove and settled into his chair to keep watch. The storm showed no signs of letting up, but here, in this humble cabin, two souls from different worlds had found shelter from its fury. Whether that shelter would prove blessing or curse, only time would tell. In the flickering firelight, Dakota studied his unexpected guest. Even in sleep, her face held a determination that reminded him of Sarah. He wondered what circumstances had brought her here, wounded and alone in a snowstorm. Those were questions for tomorrow. Tonight, there was only the quiet task of keeping the fire fed and watching over this stranger whom conscience wouldn't let him turn away. The first pale light of dawn crept through frost-edged windows, painting weak shadows across Dakota's cabin floor. The storm had settled into a sullen quiet, though bitter cold still pressed against the walls like a living thing. Dakota moved about his morning routine with careful steps. Not wanting to wake his unexpected guest, he fed small splits of pine into the stove, bringing the banked coals back to life. The familiar ritual of brewing coffee provided a touch of normalcy to this strange morning. As the pot began to bubble, rich aroma filled the cabin, almost masking the medicinal smell of the witch hazel he'd used on Noya's wound. The Comanche girl lay wrapped in blankets near the stove, her face troubled, even in sleep. Every now and then she would stir and murmur words he couldn't understand, her fingers clutching at the blankets. The fever hadn't broken yet, but at least her breathing seemed stronger than the night before. Dakota's gaze fell on her torn satchel, which he'd placed on his table the night before. In the growing light, he could see it was finely made of soft deer hide, decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of many careful hours. Something about its craftsmanship made him hesitate to examine it further. But he needed to know more about the young woman he'd brought into his home. The satchel's contents had spilled partly onto the table: a folded paper and a beaded necklace. The paper bore official-looking seals that made his heart sink. Army seals. Nothing good ever came of army business, in his experience. The necklace was simply made, but beautiful, blue and white beads forming a pattern like flowing water. A soft sound drew his attention back to Noya. Her eyes were open, watching him with a mix of wariness and pain. "Water," Dakota offered, keeping his voice gentle. When she nodded, he helped her sit up enough to drink from a tin cup. Her hands shook, but she managed it herself, pride evident in the set of her jaw. "The paper," she said after drinking, her English slow but clear. "It is important. Please." "It's safe," Dakota assured her, bringing both items to show her. "Your necklace too." Relief softened her features as she touched the beadwork. "My mother made this. The water pattern is our family's mark." Dakota nodded, then gestured to the paper. "Army business is dangerous business," he said carefully. "Why? Do you carry such things?" Noya struggled to sit up straighter, dignity gathering around her like a cloak despite her weakness. "I am Noya, daughter of Chief Walking Bear of the Pennatica Comanche. These papers are our life." She touched the seals with reverent fingers. 20 winters ago, Army men made treaty with my father's father. They promised our people rights to the winter waters of Blue Creek Valley. Each year, we must renew this promise with their officers. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if the telling itself gave her strength. "My father is too ill to travel. He trusted me to carry our proof to the army post and bring back new papers. You traveled alone?" Dakota couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. A flash of that earlier defiance sparked in her eyes. "I am not afraid. But there are men, bad men, who do not want us to have the water rights. They attacked me 2 days' ride from here. I escaped, but..." She touched her wounded side and fell. Silent, Dakota stood and walked to the window, his thoughts churning like the snow outside. The army post was another day's ride at least, and that was in good weather. The valley roads would be buried for days after this storm. Helping her meant risking everything he'd built here, his ranch, his reputation, maybe even his freedom, if her attackers came looking. But as he turned back to study her, he saw something in her bearing that reminded him of his own people's struggles. The courage it took to carry such a burden alone. The weight of an entire community's hopes resting on one person's shoulders. Moving to the stove, he ladled a small portion of venison stew into a bowl. The meat was well stewed with winter vegetables, tender enough for someone recovering from root injury. "You need strength," he said, offering it to her. "Eat what you can, then rest." Noya accepted the bowl with formal grace. "You are kind, Dakota. I will not forget this." "You can stay one day," he said, his deep voice gentle but firm. "The storm is easing, but the roads are deep with snow. When you're stronger, we will speak more of your journey." She nodded, understanding. The unspoken question in his words, whether he would help her beyond this shelter he'd already provided. They both knew she couldn't reach the army post alone in her condition. Outside, the wind had dropped to a whisper. Weak sunlight gleamed on the unbroken expanse of snow that buried the valley. Dakota watched a lone crow wing its way across the white sky, black against all that brightness. Like that bird, Noya was far from her people, carrying a burden too, heavy for her alone. Yet something in her fierce determination touched a chord in him. He'd thought long silent. He turned back to find she had finished most of the stew. Her eyes were growing heavy again, the effort of eating and talking draining what little strength she had. As she drifted back to sleep, her hands still curved protectively around the beaded necklace, Dakota added more wood to the stove and settled in his chair to think. Through the window, he could see the snow had drifted halfway up his corral fence. The valley roads would be impassable for days. Time enough to decide what conscience and wisdom demanded of him. The coffee pot bubbled quietly, filling the cabin with its rich scent. Outside, the storm-swept world waited in frozen silence, while inside, An Apache rancher watched over a Comanche chief's daughter and pondered the strange paths that brought two souls together in times of need. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-laden yard as Clara made her way back from the chicken coop, her small boots leaving a trail of footprints behind her. Her arms hugged an empty feed bucket against her chest, protecting it from the bitter wind that still whipped across the highlands. The familiar sight of smoke rising from their cabin's chimney promised warmth ahead. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, stamping her feet to shake off the snow. The words she'd been about to speak to her uncle died on her lips as she caught sight of the stranger lying near their stove. Clara froze, the bucket slipping from her grip to land with a dull thud on the plank floor. Dakota rose from his chair by the fire, his large frame casting a protective shadow. "Clara," he said softly, "come here, child." She darted behind his chair, peering around it with wide eyes at the young woman wrapped in their spare blankets. The stranger's dark hair fell in long braids, and her clothing was different from anything Clara had seen before, beautifully beaded leather that spoke of another people entirely. "This is Noya," Dakota explained, his deep voice gentle. "She was hurt in the storm. She needs our help for a little while." Clara gripped the back of his chair tighter, studying the stranger with the solemn intensity that had marked her character since her mother's death 2 years ago. The woman Noya turned her head slowly, and Clara was surprised to see warmth in her tired eyes. "Hello, little one," Noya said softly, her English careful but clear. "Your uncle is very kind to help me." Clara remained silent, but her grip on the chair loosened slightly. Something about Noya's voice reminded her of her mother, not the words themselves, but the gentle way she spoke them. Noya shifted slightly, wincing at the movement, but her smile remained. "Would you like to hear a song?" she asked. "One my mother taught me when I was small, like you." Clara glanced up at Dakota, who gave a slight nod. Slowly, she edged out from behind the chair. Though she stayed close to her uncle's side, Noya's voice rose softly in the quiet cabin, the strange melody floating like smoke in the winter air. Though Clara couldn't understand the Comanche words, the tune itself spoke of comfort and safety, of mothers singing children to sleep under star-filled skies. Without realizing it, she took a step forward, then another. When the song ended, Noya explained, "My mother sang this to me every night when I was small. It tells of how the evening star watches over all children while they sleep." She patted the floor beside her. "Would you like to learn it?" Clara looked up at Dakota again, seeking permission. At his gentle nudge, she moved closer to Noya, settling cross-legged on the floor beside her. Soon, Noya was teaching her the first few words. Patient as Clara stumbled over the unfamiliar sounds, Dakota watched them for a moment, something tight in his chest loosening at the sight. Then he turned his attention to the more pressing matter at hand. Noya's wound needed proper tending. The makeshift bandage he'd applied last night wouldn't be enough. The sensible thing would be to take her to town, to the doctor there. But Dakota knew all too well how that would end. The townsfolk barely tolerated his presence as it was, an Apache running a small ranch on the outskirts of their territory. If he brought a wounded Comanche woman into their midst, he'd seen their violence before, their quick rush to judgment. No, he would have to do this himself. He had some basic medical supplies: needle, catgut thread, witch hazel for cleaning. His hands were big and rough from ranch work, better suited to mending harnesses than human flesh, but they would have to do. "Clara," he called softly, "would you fetch the medical box from the shelf? It's the one your mama kept?" While Clara retrieved the worn wooden box, Dakota heated water on the stove. He laid out what he would need on a clean cloth needle, thread, bandages his sister had rolled and stored away. The sight of her neat handiwork made his throat tighten momentarily. "This will hurt," he warned Noya, kneeling beside her with the hot water and supplies. But it must be done. Noya nodded, her face set with quiet determination. Clara hovered nearby, worrying at her lower lip with her teeth. Perhaps another song. Noya suggested to Clara, her voice steady despite the pain Dakota knew she must be. Feeling, "You can help me remember the words we learned." As Clara's small voice joined with Noya's, Dakota cleaned and stitched the wound as carefully as he could. His stitches weren't as neat as a doctor's would have been, but they were strong and would hold. Throughout it all, Noya remained still, only the occasional catch in her singing betraying her discomfort. By the time he finished, the short winter day was fading. Clara helped him put away the medical supplies while Noya rested, her face pale but peaceful. Then Clara surprised them both by heading to the kitchen area and beginning to prepare their evening meal, just as she did every day. The familiar sounds of cooking filled the cabin, the scrape of the cast-iron pot, the soft thump of Clara's wooden spoon against its sides as she stirred the beans that had been simmering all day. She added a pinch of salt, just as her mother had taught her, then began mixing cornbread batter in a bowl. Soon, a warm smell of baking bread mingled with the hearty scent of beans. The three of them ate together in companionable silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional pop of wood in the stove. As Dakota rose later to bank the fire for the night, he paused, struck by the difference in his cabin. For so long it had been filled with the heavy silence of grief, his own and Clara's. The quiet had become like another presence in their home, as much a part of it as the furniture or the winter drafts that crept through the log walls. But now there were voices again. Clara's small one, stronger than it had been in months. Noya's, gentle and musical, speaking of mothers and songs and stars. Even his own, drawn out of its long silence by the strange circumstances that had brought them together. He glanced over at where Clara sat beside Noya. The two of them bent over something, the beaded necklace. He realized as Noya explained the meaning of its patterns. His niece's face was animated in a way he hadn't seen since before his sister's death. Her usual solemnity replaced by genuine interest. The fire settled in the stove with a soft crackle, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had died down to a whisper, and the first stars were appearing in the winter sky. Inside, the cabin held its own kind of warmth, one that went beyond the heat of the stove. Dawn painted the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold. As Dakota hitched his horse to the wagon, the morning air bit sharp and clean, making his breath cloud in front of him. He'd put off the trip to town as long as he could, but they were running low on essentials. Salt for preserving meat, oil for the lamp things they couldn't do without. "Stay inside today," he told Noya, who sat wrapped in a quilt by the fire. "Clara knows the morning chores." His niece nodded solemnly from where she stood by the stove, stirring a pot of morning porridge. "I will help her," Noya promised, her dark eyes steady on his. "We will be careful." The 7-mile drive to town took longer than usual with the snow-packed roads. Dakota's wagon wheels crunched through the fresh powder as his horses picked their way carefully down the valley. Use the time to plan it in. Get supplies, get out. No lingering, no conversations. The fewer people who noticed him, the better. The main street of Silver Creek was already busy when he arrived, despite the early hour. Horses stomped at hitching posts while their riders ducked in and out of the mercantile and saloon. Women in long skirts hurried between errands, their boots leaving delicate tracks in the fresh snow. Dakota tied his team outside the mercantile and ducked inside. The store's bell jangled as he entered, and warm air, thick with the smell of coffee, tobacco, and leather goods washed over him. He kept his hat low and moved quietly despite his size. Gathering his items with practiced efficiency, he was reaching for a tin of lamp oil when Clayton Briggs's voice cut through the store's murmur. "I'm telling you, Thompson, they've been seen." All through the valley, Comanches scouting our lands. Dakota's hand stilled on the shelf. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed as he listened. "You sure about that, Briggs?" someone asked. "My men spotted their tracks yesterday, heading toward the highlands." Briggs's voice carried the familiar note of righteous anger that always drew a crowd. Fresh tracks in the new snow. And that ain't all. They found signs of camps hidden up in the draws. They're planning something, mark my words. Dakota could hear the shuffling of feet as people gathered closer to listen. The creak of floorboards, the nervous whispers, but the treaty someone started. "Treaty," Briggs spat the word. "That piece of paper ain't worth the ink it's written with. They're savages, pure and simple. Won't rest till they've driven us all out, or worse." More murmurs of agreement now. Dakota carefully selected his lamp oil and moved toward the counter, keeping his movements measured and calm, though his heart beat faster. "Maybe we ought to organize some men," Thompson suggested. "Patrol the valley. Already ahead of you there," Briggs said. "Got my boys riding the fence lines. Any Indian shows their face in my territory, they'll wish they hadn't." Tokita set his items on the counter: salt, lamp oil, coffee, sugar. The shopkeeper's wife totaled his purchase with shaking hands, her eyes darting between him and the group gathered around Briggs. Dakota paid without speaking and gathered his supplies. As he turned to leave, he caught Briggs's eye for just a moment. The rancher's face twisted in a sneer, but Dakota kept his expression neutral. He'd learned long ago that showing no reaction was often the best defense. The bell jangled again as he stepped out into the cold. Behind him, Briggs's voice rose once more, and that Apache squatter up in the highlands wouldn't trust him neither, probably in league with them. Tokita loaded his supplies quickly, trying to ignore the sideways glances from townsfolk hurrying past. The 7 miles home seemed longer than ever, each creak of the wagon wheels matching the worried rhythm of his thoughts. Back at the ranch, Clara and Noya sat close together on a bench near the fire, their heads bent over something small and bright. Colored glass beads caught the afternoon light as Noya's skilled fingers demonstrated a pattern. "Like this," she was saying softly. "Each color has meaning. Blue for sky, red for sunset, white for snow." She guided Clara's smaller hands through the motions of threading a bead onto the thin leather cord. Clara's face held a look of intense concentration as she copied the pattern. "And these?" she asked, touching a string of yellow beads. "Those are for corn ripening in summer," Noya explained. "When I was your age, my mother taught me these patterns, just as her mother taught her." "Did you have to leave your mother to come here?" Clara asked, her voice quiet but direct in the way of children. Noya's hands stilled for a moment. "It was my duty," she said finally. "My father is leader of our band. When the army called for treaty papers, he could not leave our people. So I volunteered to carry them." Pride and sadness mingled in her voice. "Sometimes we must do difficult things to protect those we love." Clara nodded, understanding in her young face. "Like when Uncle Dakota has to go to town, even though people there are mean to him." Noya touched Clara's cheek gently. "Yes, little sister. Just like that." The moment was broken by the sound of wagon wheels outside. Clara jumped up to help unload supplies while Noya moved away from the window, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. Tokita entered, stamping snow from his boots. His face was grim as he set down the supplies. "There's trouble brewing," he said, without preamble. "Clayton Briggs is stirring up fear in town. Says his men have seen Comanche scouts in the valley." Noya's face tightened. People would not send scouts. "We come openly, with treaty papers, not in secret." "Truth matters less than fear to men like Briggs," Tokita said. "He's using it to turn the town against all Indians." They're talking about organizing patrols. He turned to Noya, his dark eyes serious. You'll need to stay inside, away from the windows. If anyone rides close, hide in the root cellar. Noya straightened her shoulders, though her face was pale. I cannot hide forever. The papers must reach the army post within days, or the water. Rights my people were promised will be forfeit. Already I have delayed too long. The wind outside had died to a whisper, and in the sudden quiet, they could hear the distant howl of a coyote. Dakota looked at Noya, seeing both her determination and her fear. He thought of Briggs's men riding the valley with guns and hate. Then he thought of a people waiting for water rights that meant life itself. We'll figure something out, he said finally. But for tonight, rest. You're still healing. Clara brought them all cups of coffee, and they sat in troubled silence as darkness crept across the valley. Outside, the first stars appeared in a sky as vast and cold as uncertainty itself. Dawn painted the highlands in shades of rose and gold. But Dakota took no time to admire it. He moved with purpose through his morning chores, checking harnesses and loading supplies into the wagon. Every so often, his eyes scanned the ridgeline, watching for dust that might signal riders. The morning air bit sharp and clean. His breath came out in white puffs as he worked. Inside the cabin, Clara helped Noya pack dried meat, cornbread, and coffee for the journey. Though Noya's wound was healing, she still moved stiffly, holding her side when she thought no one was looking. I can help, Clara said for the third time that morning, her small face pinched with worry. I won't be any trouble, Uncle Dakota. Please. Dakota paused in adjusting the wagon's brake. No, Clara. It's too dangerous. He softened his voice at her crestfallen expression. Mrs. Henderson will look after you. It's only for a few days. But what if something happens to you? Clara's lower lip trembled. What if Mr. Briggs's men find you? Nothing will happen, Dakota said firmly, though the same worry had kept him awake most of the night. He knelt down to Clara's level, his large hands gentle on her shoulders. I need you safe? Can you be brave for me? Clara nodded, but tears spilled down her cheeks. She threw her arms around his neck, and Dakota held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of soap and wool. When she finally pulled back, she wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Promise you'll come back. I promise. Dakota stood, his knees creaking from the cold. Now help me get these blankets loaded. By mid-morning, the wagon was ready. Dakota had chosen his steadiest horse, Old Thunder, who could handle the icy mountain passes without spooking. The big bay stamped his feet impatiently while Dakota made one final check of their supplies. No YA emerged from the cabin, wrapped in a borrowed wool coat, her dark hair hidden beneath a knitted scarf. She carried herself carefully, but with dignity, refusing help as she climbed onto the wagon seat. In her satchel, the treaty papers lay protected between layers of oilcloth. The army post is 2 days' ride, Dakota said, consulting his pocket. Watch. We'll need to make good time before the weather turns. Mrs. Henderson's wagon appeared over the rise, right on schedule. The widow was a kind soul who asked few questions, one of the rare neighbors who treated Dakota with respect. Clara's face crumpled again as Dakota lifted her into the other wagon. Be good, he told her. Mind Mrs. Henderson. Yes, Uncle. Clara's voice was small. She looked at Noya. Be careful with your stitches. They might pull if you move too fast. Twaya reached across to squeeze Clara's hand. I will be careful, little sister. Thank you for your kindness. They set out as the sun climbed higher, Thunder's hooves breaking through the crusted snow. The wagon wheels made a rhythmic crunching sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. Dakota kept to the less traveled paths, avoiding the main road, where they might meet other travelers. By midday, they had covered several miles of difficult terrain. Thunder needed rest, and Dakota could see Noya was fighting pain despite her stoic expression. He found a sheltered hollow where a stand of pine trees blocked the wind. "We'll stop here," he said, helping Noya down from the wagon. "Rest a spell. Have some coffee." While Thunder grazed on patches of dry grass poking through the snow, Dakota built a small fire. He kept the flames low to minimize smoke, though the pine branches above would help disperse it. Soon, the familiar smell of coffee filled the air. Noya sat on a fallen log, warming her hands around the tin cup Dakota offered. After a few sips, color returned to her face. "My people once wandered these lands freely," she said suddenly, her voice soft but clear. "Now we are confined to reservations where nothing grows. The wells run dry. Cattlemen build dams across the streams that once fed our gardens." She touched the satchel at her side. "These papers prove our right to the water. Without them, we cannot survive another summer." Dakota said nothing, but he listened. He understood about survival, about watching helplessly as others took what was yours. His own people had similar stories. They continued their journey as afternoon shadows lengthened. Across the snow, the trail grew steeper, winding through narrow passes where the wagon barely fit. Thunder picked his way carefully, steam rising from his flanks despite the cold. Just before sunset, they reached an abandoned line shack Dakota remembered from his scouting days. The roof sagged and the door hung crooked, but the walls were solid, enough to block the wind. "We'll stop here," he said, pulling Thunder to a halt. "Too dangerous to travel these paths after dark." The shack's interior smelled of dust and old wood. A broken chair lay in one corner, and mouse droppings littered the floor, but it was dry. Dakota spread their blankets near the wagon, which he had backed up close to the door. Better to sleep outside where they could hear anyone approaching. Noya made a simple meal of cornbread and dried meat while Dakota tended to Thunder. They ate in companionable silence as stars began appearing in the deepening blue above. The cold grew sharper with nightfall, and Noya wrapped herself tighter in her blankets. "Sleep," Dakota told her. "I'll keep watch." Noya nodded, already heavy-eyed. "From the long day's travel, thank you," she said quietly. "For risking this journey. I know what it might cost you." Dakota merely grunted in response, but her words echoed in his mind as she drifted off to sleep. What would this journey cost him? His ranch, if Briggs turned the town fully against him. His life, if they were caught helping a Comanche. He leaned back against the wagon wheel, rifle across his knees. Above him, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, cold and distant as fate itself. Somewhere in the darkness, a lone coyote called, its cry floating unanswered across the highland silence. What fate had he tied himself to? The question hung in the frosty air, but Dakota knew the answer lay in his own conscience. Some choices once made could not be unmade. Like the tracks they'd left in the snow behind them, they could only lead forward. Dawn painted the sky in pale streaks of pink and gold. Frost sparkled on the wagon's wooden boards as Dakota hitched Thunder back into his traces. The old horse's breath formed clouds in the crisp morning air. Nearby, Noya wrapped her blankets tighter, fighting a shiver that seemed to come from deep inside. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The wagon's wheels groaned against the frozen ground, searching for purchase on the steep mountain trail. Thunder leaned into his work, hooves striking sparks from scattered stones beneath the snow. "Trail gets worse ahead," Dakota warned, keeping his voice low. "Hold tight to the seatboard." Noya nodded, her jaw set against the pain that grew with each jolt of the wagon. The color had drained from her face, leaving dark circles beneath her eyes, but she sat straight-backed and alert. Her hand never strayed far from the precious satchel at her side. The morning wore on, made treacherous mirrors of the shadowed parts of the trail. Twice, Thunder's hooves slipped, and Dakota had to guide him carefully back to safer ground. The wagon wheels left deep ruts in their wake, marking their passage for any who might follow. Near midday, they rounded a bend and came upon an unexpected sight. A settler family huddled around their wagon, which listed badly to one side. A broken axle had spilled their goods across the snow. The father worked frantically with inadequate tools while his wife tried to comfort two small children. Dakota's first instinct was to pass by. They couldn't afford delays, not with Noya's strength failing and unknown eyes perhaps watching the trails. But the sight of those children, red-faced with cold, pulled at something in his chest. He drew Thunder to a halt. "Stay in the wagon," he told Noya quietly. "Keep the blankets close." The settler looked up warily as Dakota approached. Hope and fear warred in his weather-beaten face. "Don't mean to trouble you, mister," he said. Axle snapped clean through. Dakota studied the brake. "I have tools. Maybe we can help." Relief flooded the man's features. "Much obliged." "Name's Daniel Weber. That's my wife Sarah and our little ones." For the next hour, Dakota worked alongside Weber to repair the axle. He had a spare length of sturdy wood in his wagon, and together they shaped it to fit. The children watched with fascination as Dakota's large hands moved with surprising delicacy over the wooden shaft. Sarah. Weber brought them cups of thin coffee. Her eyes strayed curiously to the bundled figure in Dakota's wagon. "Your companion seems poorly," she said. "Is there anything we can do?" "My kin," Dakota said shortly, taking her for medical help. He turned back to his work, making it clear the subject was closed. When the axle was finally secured, Weber tried to press a few coins into Dakota's hand. "It's not much," but Dakota shook his head. "Keep it. You'll need it." "God bless you, friend," Sarah called as they prepared to leave. "We'll pray for your kin's recovery." Dakota touched his hat brim in acknowledgement, then clucked Thunder into motion. As they pulled away, he heard one of the children ask, "Mama, why was that lady hiding?" They pushed on through the afternoon, climbing higher into the mountains. Noya's breathing grew labored, and she pressed one hand against her wounded side. Still, she made no complaint. The sun was already dropping toward the western peaks when they finally caught sight of the army. Post. Fort Collins stood like a wooden crown on the mountainside, its walls sharp against the darkening sky. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, carrying the smell of coffee and cook fires. As they approached the gates, two soldiers stepped forward, rifles held ready. "Halt and state your business," one called out. Dakota drew Thunder to a stop. "Need?" To see the commanding officer, he said clearly, "Important business." The soldiers exchanged glances as Noya sat up straighter, letting her blankets fall back slightly. Their eyes widened at the sight of her distinctly Comanche features. "Wait here," the first soldier said. He disappeared through the gate while his companion kept watch, finger near his rifle's trigger. Minutes stretched like hours in the gathering dusk. Dakota could feel the tension radiating from the remaining guard, who clearly didn't know what to make of an Apache man escorting a Comanche woman. Finally, footsteps approached from within the fort. "Bring them inside," a new voice commanded. "The major will see them." They were led through the gate into a courtyard lit by hanging lanterns. Soldiers paused in their evening routines to stare. Dakota helped Noya down from the wagon, supporting her as she swayed slightly on her feet. The major's office occupied one corner of the fort's main building. Inside, oil lamps cast yellow light over a desk piled with papers. Major Harrison looked up as they entered, his lined face showing equal parts weariness and skepticism. "I'm told you have urgent business," he said. "Make it quick." Noya stepped forward. Though exhausted and in pain, she drew herself up with quiet dignity. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed the papers from her satchel, but her voice was steady. "I come on behalf of my father, Chief Standing Bear of the Comanche," she said. These documents prove our people's right to the water sources in Bitter Creek Valley. Rights guaranteed by treaty 20 years ago. She laid the papers carefully. On the major's desk, in the lamplight, the official seals gleamed dully red, like drops of blood on the yellowed pages. Harrison picked up the top sheet, eyes moving quickly over the text. His expression gave nothing away. The room fell silent except for the tick of a clock on the wall. Dakota stood just behind Noya's shoulder, ready to support her if her strength failed. But she remained standing, her dark eyes fixed on the Major's face as he read their future in those aging papers. Major Harrison set the papers down with deliberate care. The lamplight cast deep shadows across his weathered face as he leaned back. In his chair, silence stretched between them like a taut rope. "The treaty appears genuine," he said finally, tapping the official seals with one finger. "But times have changed since this was signed. 20 years is a long time." Noya's hands clenched at her sides. "The promises made to my people do not fade with time," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "The water rights spelled out in those papers are as real today as they were then. Young lady, you must understand. The territory has grown. New settlers arrive daily, bringing cattle, building homes. Water is precious to everyone now. It is life itself to us." Noya stepped forward, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Without access to those streams, our herds will die. Our children," her voice caught, "our children will go hungry. Already the wells run low because ranchers upstream take more than their share." Dakota, who had been standing silent near the door, spoke up. "Men like Clayton Briggs dam the creeks, divert the flow to their own lands. They face no punishment." The Major's eyes narrowed at the mention of Briggs. "Us. That's a serious accusation." "It is truth," Dakota said simply. Harrison shuffled the papers, clearly uncomfortable. "I will review these documents thoroughly, consult with my superiors, but I cannot promise immediate action. These matters are complex." "How long?" Noya asked. "Weeks. Perhaps months. The proper channels must be followed." Noya swayed slightly, exhaustion and disappointment taking their toll. Dakota moved closer, ready to steady her if needed. "You may stay within the fort tonight," Harrison said, his tone softening slightly. "We have a small infirmary. She stays with me," Tokuda interrupted. The Major looked startled, but Tokuda's expression left no room for argument. "Very well. Jenkins will show you to one of the storage rooms. It's warm at least." Harrison gathered the treaty papers into a neat stack. "I truly am sorry. I cannot do more tonight." Outside the office, a young soldier led them across the torchlit courtyard. Their boots crunched on packed snow as they passed between the wooden buildings. Soldiers paused in their evening tasks to stare. Some whispered behind their hands, snickering. Others watched with something closer to sympathy in their eyes. The storage room was small but clean, with rough plank walls and a plank floor swept free of dust. A pot-bellied stove in one corner gave off welcome heat. Bare shelves lined the walls, holding supplies wrapped in brown paper. "I'll bring some blankets," Jenkins said, then hesitated. "And maybe some hot coffee." "Thank you," Noya said softly. The young soldier nodded and hurried away. When they were alone, Noya sank onto a wooden crate, her shoulders slumping. "All this way," she whispered. "All this risk for nothing." "Not nothing," Dakota said. He checked the stove's damper, adjusting it to hold the heat. "The papers are delivered. They cannot pretend now that they do not know. But they will not." The Major's words were empty, like wind in dry grass. Noya pressed her hand against her wounded side, wincing. "What will I tell my father? Our people?" Jenkins returned with an armload of gray wool blankets and a steaming pot of coffee. He also brought 2 tin cups and a small loaf of bread. Cook said you might be hungry, he mumbled, setting everything down quickly before retreating. Dakota poured the coffee, handed Noya a cup. She wrapped her fingers around it, seeking warmth. Tell them you survived, he said, answering her earlier question. Tell them you carried their voice across the mountains, through storm and pain, and spoke truth to power. That is no small thing. Is survival enough? She asked. Dakota was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if seeking wisdom in its dark depths. Sometimes, he said finally, survival itself is victory. My people know this. Yours do too. But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at him. Was survival truly enough? Or was it just what they told themselves to ease the sting of defeat? Through the wooden walls came the muffled sounds of the fort settling into night. Boot steps, unpacked earth. The crack of a rifle at the changing of the guard. Voices rising and falling in conversation. Did you hear? One voice said, closer than the others. Some Comanche girl rode in with treaty papers. Claims they own the water rights to half the valley. That'll set Briggs off right proper. Another answered with a laugh. He don't take kindly to Indians telling him where he can water his cattle. Shame about the girl, though. Rode all this way for nothing, I reckon. Ain't our problem. Long as they clear out by morning. The voices faded. Noya had her eyes closed, but Dakota knew she'd heard every word. He spread the blankets on the floor, making as comfortable a bed as he could manage. You should rest, he said. Your wound needs healing. Noya nodded wearily. She lay down, pulling the blankets close against the chill that seemed to seep through the walls despite the stove's heat. Dakota settled nearby, his back against a crate, prepared to keep watch through the night. Thank you, Noya murmured, already half asleep, for not leaving me to face this alone. Dakota said nothing, but in the dim light from the stove, his expression softened. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of more snow. Within the storage room, two people from different tribes, brought together by chance and conscience, found what rest they could while uncertainty hung heavy in the air. The treaty papers lay in the major's office, their red seals catching the last light of the dying lamp. Their promises remained unfulfilled, their power yet to be tested against the rising tide of greed and progress that threatened to wash away the old ways. The old agreements, like footprints in shifting sand, dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Dakota and Noya prepared to leave Fort Collins. The night's snowfall had left everything pristine and silent, broken only by the crunch of boots and the gentle nickering of their horse. Major Harrison met them at the gate, his breath clouding in the crisp morning air. I will consider the treaty's enforcement carefully, he said, handing Noya the papers. That's all I can promise for now. Noya tucked the documents safely into her satchel, her face composed despite the uncertainty. We are grateful for your consideration, she said with quiet dignity. They set out as the sun cleared the horizon, their wagon leaving twin trails in the fresh snow. The return journey seemed lighter somehow, as if the simple act of delivering the papers had lifted a burden. The horse moved at a steady pace, steam rising from its flanks. After several miles, Noya broke their comfortable silence. The morning reminds me of a story my grandmother tells about how the sun and snow became friends. Dakota glanced at her, a slight smile tugging at his lips. How did that happen? Sun was lonely because his warmth kept others at a distance. Snow was lonely because her cold made others hurry away. But together, they created beauty, snow sparkling like countless stars in sunlight. As she spoke, she gestured to the glittering landscape around them. A soft laugh escaped Dakota, the first she'd heard from him. The sound surprised them both. My niece would love that tale, he said. Clara, Noya smiled, touching the beaded bracelet on her wrist. The colorful glass beads caught the sunlight, sending tiny rainbows dancing. She has a gift for seeing beauty in small things, like her mother did. Tokota's voice grew soft with memory. My sister could find joy in a single wildflower pushing through stone. They stopped at midday to rest the horse and share a simple meal of dried meat and cornbread. The sun had warmed the air enough to make their heavy coats uncomfortable. As they sat on a fallen log, Noya noticed how Tokota's shoulders had relaxed, how his usual watchful expression had eased. "Tell me about your wife," she said gently, "if you wish to speak of her." Tokota was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began, his deep voice tender with remembrance. "Sarah was like water in the desert, life-giving, precious. She taught at the mission school where I worked as a scout. She saw past what others feared in me. How did you meet?" "I brought in a lost child, a settler's daughter who had wandered too far. Sarah was the one who calmed the girl, sang to her, until her parents arrived." He paused, lost in the memory. "She sang to everyone, hymns in English, lullabies in Apache. Said music was God's way of healing broken spirits." Noya listened, hearing all he didn't say about love and loss in the spaces between his words. As the afternoon waned, they came upon a creek, its surface a sheet of crystalline ice beneath snow. Noya asked to stop, and Tokota helped her down from the wagon. She moved carefully to the creek's edge, mindful of her healing wound. "Among my people, we give thanks for water, even when it sleeps beneath ice," she explained. "Would you join me?" Tokota nodded, following her lead as she raised her hands to the pale winter sky. In her native tongue, Noya began to pray, translating softly for him between phrases. "Blessed water, carrier of life, we honor your path from cloud to earth. We thank you for your strength, your patience, your endless giving. When you flow freely again, remember us with kindness." The prayer's beauty touched something deep in Tokota's spirit. He found himself adding his own words in Apache, a blessing his grandmother had taught him long ago. Their different languages, twined together like branches reaching toward the same light dot. As sunset approached, they found a sheltered spot among a stand of cottonwoods to make camp. The trees' bare branches formed intricate patterns against the darkening sky, and there, massive trunks blocked the worst of the wind. Tokota built a fire while Noya arranged their bedrolls nearby. The flames cast dancing shadows as they shared the last of their provisions, coffee, beans, and the remainder of the fort's bread. The warmth and food loosened their tongues, and stories began to flow as naturally as spring water. Noya described the summer dances of her people, the rhythm of drums like heartbeats, the singers' voices rising to touch the stars, the dancers' feet raising dust that glowed golden in firelight. "Even the smallest children dance," she said, "learning the steps that tell our stories, that keep our memories alive." "Like Clara's mother," Tokota said softly. "She danced at every celebration, every gathering, said joy was meant to be shared." "She sounds wise." Noya added a small branch to the fire. "Clara has her spirit. I see it in how she watches everything, how she treasures small moments." "Yes," Tokota's voice held wonder. "I see it too." The fire popped and sparked, sending embers, swirling upward like earthbound stars. For the first time since finding Noya wounded in his barn, Tokota felt the weight of worry lift from his shoulders. Here, in this moment, there was only firelight, story sharing, and the simple comfort of understanding between two souls. Noya's bracelet jingled softly as she gestured, describing a ceremony where her people celebrated the first rain of spring. The sound reminded Tokota of Clara's laughter, rare but precious. Like rain itself, they talked late into the evening, sharing memories of family feasts, childhood adventures, lessons learned from elders. Their words built bridges across the differences in their backgrounds, revealing the common threads of human experience: love, loss, hope, and the endless search for belonging. When they finally settled into their bedrolls, the fire burning low, a peaceful silence wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Above, stars pierced the dark sky with ancient light, unchanged by the troubles of those who gazed up at them. For this one night, at least, sorrow's shadow had lifted. In its place bloomed something fragile and precious: trust, understanding, and the quiet joy of finding kinship in unexpected places. The future with its challenges could wait until morning. For now, there was only this moment, this sharing of stories under the vast prairie sky. This brief but beautiful peace, the second morning of their return journey, dawned clear and cold. Frost sparkled on the wagon's wooden sides as they made their way through the winding mountain paths. Dakota kept one hand on the reins, guiding their horse carefully along the narrow trail. Deep snowbanks rose on either side, hemming them in. "The pass ahead is treacherous," Dakota warned, his voice low. "Stay alert." Noya nodded, pulling her blanket tighter. The sun had barely crested the ridge, casting long shadows across their path. Their breath formed small clouds in the crisp air. The wagon wheels creaked as they entered the narrowest part of the pass. Steep rock walls towered above them, blocking most of the morning light. The horses' hooves crunched steadily through the packed snow. A sharp crack split the air. The horse reared, whinnying in terror as more gunshots echoed off the canyon walls. Dakota's heart slammed against his ribs as he recognized the sound of multiple rifles. "Get down," he shouted, already moving. He launched himself from the wagon seat, pushing Noya toward the floorboards. A bullet splintered wood near his head. 3 riders emerged from behind the rocks above Clayton Briggs and 2 of his men, their rifles aimed down at the wagon. Briggs' face twisted with cruel satisfaction. "Well, what do we have here?" he called out, his voice dripping with false cheerfulness. "An Apache helping a Comanche spy. That's mighty interesting." Dakota drew his revolver in one fluid motion, firing upward. One of Briggs' men yelped as the bullet grazed his arm. But they had the high ground and better cover. The horse, panicked by the gunfire, jerked the wagon sideways. The sudden movement sent Noya tumbling. She caught herself against the side, crying out as the impact jarred her healing wound. Dakota positioned himself between her and the attackers, returning fire when he could, but he knew they were trapped. The pass was too narrow to turn around, the walls too steep to climb. "Last chance, Indian." Briggs shouted, "Step aside and maybe we won't kill you both." Instead of answering, Dakota fired again. The shot went wide as a bullet struck the ground at his feet, throwing up snow and gravel. He heard movement behind him, boots on rock. Too late, he realized 2 more of Briggs' men had circled behind them on foot. Before he could turn, something hard struck the back of his head. The world exploded in white light and pain. Dakota staggered, his gun slipping from numb fingers. He tried to stay standing, to reach for Noya, but his legs wouldn't obey. Another blow sent him crashing to his knees. Through blurred vision, he saw Briggs' men dragging Noya from the wagon. She fought like a wildcat, kicking and twisting despite her injury. One of the men cursed as her elbow caught his nose. "Stop fighting." Dakota tried to rise, but someone kicked him hard in the ribs. He tasted blood. "Tie her up," Briggs ordered, dismounting. He walked over to where Dakota lay struggling to remain conscious. "You should have minded your own business, Apache. Now you get to watch while we take your little friend to town." Maybe they'll hang her as a spy. Maybe worse. Briggs drove his boot into Dakota's side again. The pain was distant now, like it belonged to someone else. He could only watch helplessly as they bound Noya's hands and forced her onto a horse. "Dakota," she called out, terror and concern warring in her voice. One of the men silenced her with a rough shake. "Leave him," Briggs commanded his men. "The cold will finish what we started." He swung up onto his horse, grabbing the reins of Noya's mount. "Let's go. Town's waiting for some entertainment." Takota fought to stay awake as hoofbeats faded into the distance. The last thing he saw was Noya's face, looking back at him with desperate eyes. Before the riders disappeared around a bend, time became fluid, measured only in heartbeats and waves of pain. The horse that had pulled their wagon stood trembling nearby, blood seeping from a graze on its flank. The sun crept across the sky as Takota drifted in and out of consciousness. Finally, using the wagon wheel for support, he forced himself to stand. The world tilted and spun, but he remained upright through sheer will. He had to get home. Had to find help. The horse allowed him to approach, nickering softly as he checked its wound. Not deep, thank God. He managed to calm it enough to hook up the reins, though his fingers felt thick and clumsy. "Good boy," he murmured, patting its neck. "We have to make it home. Clara's waiting." The journey back was endless. Takota walked beside the horse, one hand on the wagon to steady himself. Each step sent daggers of pain through his head and ribs. Twice he had to stop and empty his stomach by the roadside. The sun set, stars emerged, cold and distant. Still he walked, putting one foot in front of the other. He couldn't let himself think about Noya, about what might be happening in town. Focus on moving. Just keep moving. Midnight passed. The moon rose, casting silver light across the snow. Takota's legs trembled with exhaustion. Blood had frozen. In his hair, on his face, his thoughts scattered like leaves in wind. Finally, blessedly, he saw lights ahead. Home. The horse seemed to gain energy too. Recognizing familiar ground, the cabin door burst open as they approached. Clara ran out in her nightgown, her bare feet leaving tiny prints in the snow. "Uncle Takota." Her scream pierced the night as she saw his condition. What happened? Where's Noya? He tried to answer, but his tongue felt too big for his mouth. The world started to go dark around the edges. Clara's small hands caught him as his legs gave out. Somehow she helped him inside, toward the hearth where embers still glowed. "Noya?" he managed to whisper as consciousness slipped away. They took Noya. The last thing he felt was Clara's tears falling on his face as darkness claimed him. Morning. Light crept through the cabin windows, painting pale squares on the rough wooden floor. Takota stirred on his bed of blankets near the hearth, where Clara had helped him collapse the night before. Each breath sent shards of pain through his ribs. His head throbbed with every heartbeat. "Uncle?" Clara's soft voice came from nearby. She knelt beside him, her small face pinched with worry. A bowl of steaming water sat next to her, strips of clean cloth draped over her arm. Takota tried to push himself up. The room spun violently. His arms trembled, refusing to support his weight. With a grunt of frustration, he sank back onto the blankets. "Please lie still," Clara pleaded. She pressed a cool, damp cloth to the gash on his temple. "You're hurt? Bad." "Can't rest," he muttered, though his body betrayed him. "Noya needs help." Clara's hands were gentle as she cleaned dried blood from his face. She had learned herb lore from both her mother and his late wife, knowledge passed down through generations of frontier women. Now she crushed dried yarrow leaves into a poultice, just as they had taught her. "This will help stop the bleeding," she said, applying the mixture to his wounds. Her voice quavered, but her fingers remained steady. Mama always said yarrow was God's own medicine. Takota closed his eyes against sudden tears. So much of his sister lived on in her daughter, the same quiet strength, the same tender heart. He had promised to protect Clara after her mother's death. Now he had failed to protect Noya too. A sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Clara grabbed Dakota's rifle before answering, just as he had taught her. She opened the door cautiously, keeping the weapon ready. It was Mrs. Henderson from the next ranch over, her face grave beneath her bonnet. "Child, I brought news from town." She glanced at Dakota's battered form by the fire. "Though I see you already know some of it." "What are they doing to her?" Tokata demanded, forcing himself to sit up despite the pain. Mrs. Henderson twisted her hands in her apron. "They've got her locked up in old Murphy's storeroom by the saloon. Clayton Briggs is telling everyone she's a Comanche spy, come to scout. Our defenses says he caught her stealing horses and supplies." She spat in disgust. That man never met a truth he couldn't twist. Dakota's fingers clenched in the blankets. She's no spy. She carried treaty papers, papers that conveniently disappeared when Briggs caught her. Mrs. Henderson's tone was bitter. "He claims they were fake anyway. Most folks believe him, or pretend to. They're scared of Indians, and Briggs knows just how to feed those fears." "What will they do to her?" Clara whispered. The older woman's face softened. "Nothing yet, child. The sheriff's away in Denver, won't be back for 3 days at least. Then they'll keep her locked up." "3 days," Dakota muttered. His head swam as he tried to stand. The room tilted dangerously. "You're in no shape to help anyone right now," Mrs. Henderson scolded, pushing him back down. "That girl needs you alive and healing, not killing yourself trying to be a hero." She was right, though the truth of it burned like acid in his throat. He could barely walk, let alone fight. And any rescue attempt would only prove Briggs's lies about Comanche raiders. After Mrs. Henderson left, Clara brought him broth and willow bark tea for the pain. He forced himself to eat, knowing he needed strength. But each spoonful tasted like ashes. The day crawled by in a haze of pain and helpless rage. Clara tended his wounds, changed poultices, and helped him move to his bed when the fire burned. Lo! Through it all, Dakota's thoughts circled like hungry wolves. "I failed her. My weakness doomed her. Compassion made me soft, and now she pays the price." Night fell early, as it always did in winter. Clara finally succumbed to exhaustion, curling up in her small bed across the room. Her quiet breathing soon filled the darkness. Dakota lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The wind outside had risen, rattling the shutters with spectral fingers. It carried the bitter bite of coming snow. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, his voice rough with unshed tears. "I don't understand your ways. When my wife died, I accepted it as your will. When my sister followed, leaving Clara alone, I trusted you had purpose in it." He paused, swallowing hard. "But this, was I wrong to help her? Did mercy make me weak?" The wind howled around the cabin corners, offering no answer. Dakota pressed, his palms against his eyes. I thought maybe you sent her to heal something in me, to remind me that love is stronger than fear." His whispered words caught in his throat. "But now she suffers for my choice. If that was your plan, I failed to see it through. Failed her. Failed you." Tears slid from beneath his fingers, tracking silently down his temples. "Please," he breathed. "Give me strength to make this right. Show me the path. I'm lost in darkness. Lord, I need your light." The prayer felt inadequate, fumbling, but something eased in his chest as the words left him. Like a knot loosening, just slightly. He had no answers, no clear path forward, but he was not alone in the dark. Across the valley in Murphy's storeroom beside the saloon, Noya sat with her back against rough wooden walls. Her hands were bound with rope, attached to an iron ring set in the floor. The gash in her side throbbed, but she refused to show pain when her captors checked on her dot. The room stank of spilled whiskey and old tobacco. Raucous laughter and piano. Music filtered through the wall from the saloon next door. Someone was singing a bawdy song about a cowboy and his horse. Noya closed her eyes, trying to shut out the noise. In her mind, she reached for the prayers her grandmother had taught her, ancient words passed down through generations of her people. Prayers for strength, for courage, for the wisdom of ancestors. "Grandfather," she whispered in Comanche, her voice barely stirring the air, "I am your daughter's daughter. The blood of warriors flows in my veins. Give me their courage now." The words seemed to settle around her like a familiar blanket, warming something deep inside. She thought of her father, waiting for news of the treaty. Of her people's children, who would go hungry without access to water. Of Dakota and Clara, who had shown her such kindness. "Watch over them," she prayed. "Keep them safe, and help me be strong, like the mountains that shelter our people. Help me endure, like the rivers that never stop flowing." Chains clinked softly as she shifted position, but her spirit felt lighter, buoyed by the ancient words. They could bind her body, but they could not chain her heart or her faith. Through the long night, two sets of prayers rose from different corners of the valley, though separated by distance and darkness. They twined together like smoke, rising to the stars, a bridge of unseen strength spanning the space between lonely souls. The wind continued its mournful song, rattling doors and windows. But within two hearts, a quiet flame of hope refused to die. Dawn painted the eastern sky in streaks of pale gold. Dakota stood at his cabin window, watching light creep across the frozen valley. Every movement sent daggers of pain through his battered body, but his mind was clear. He could not hide here while Noya suffered. Clara appeared at his elbow, holding out his coat. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. Her chin lifted in a way that reminded him powerfully of her mother. "It's not safe," he began, but she cut him off. "Miss Noya needs us both," she insisted. "And you can barely walk straight, Uncle Dakota. You need me too." He studied her determined face. She was right, he could barely mount his horse alone. And perhaps a child's presence might remind the townsfolk of their better nature. He nodded slowly. "Stay close to me," he said, shrugging into his coat. No matter what happens, the ride into town was slow torture. Every hoofbeat jarred his bruised ribs, and the cold wind cut through his clothes like knives. Clara rode behind him, her small arms wrapped tight around his waist. Neither spoke as they passed the first scattered buildings on the town's edge. Faces appeared in windows. Women drew their children inside. Men stopped their work to stare. Word of their approach spread ahead of them like ripples in a pond. The church bell began to toll, its solemn notes echoing across the quiet streets. Dakota felt Clara stiffen against his back. "Look," she whispered. People were streaming toward the white-painted church, Sunday best mixed with work clothes. At the head of the crowd strode Clayton Briggs, practically dragging Noya by a rope tied to her bound hands. Her head was high, despite obvious exhaustion, her steps steady. "You mean to try her?" Dakota growled. "Before God and the whole town?" It urged their horse forward, ignoring the pain that threatened to blacken his vision. They reached the church steps just as Clayton was shoving Noya through the door. "Help me down," Dakota told Clara through gritted teeth. She scrambled down first, then braced his arm as he half fell from the saddle. Together, they climbed the wooden steps. Inside, the church was already packed. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in golden shafts. The air smelled of wood, polish, and fear. Clayton had forced Noya to stand before the altar rail. Reverend Matthews, the young preacher, twisted his hands nervously in his black coat. "Brothers and sisters," Clayton called out, his voice filling the sacred space. "We gather to pass judgment on this Comanche spy. She is no spy." Codas deep voice cut through the murmurs. Heads turned as he limped down the center aisle, Clara's small hand steady on his arm. Clayton's face darkened. "Well, if it ain't the Indian lover himself, come to defend your savage friend." Several people gasped at such language in church. Reverend Matthews stepped forward, raising his hands. "Please, Mr. Briggs, this is God's house. Let us speak with civility, civility." Clayton spat. "While these heathens plot against us, look at these so-called treaty papers." He waved the documents he'd stolen from Noya. Worthless scraps, meant to fool honest folk. She was caught scouting our defenses. Planning raids, she was delivering those papers to the army post. Dakota interrupted. He reached the front pew and gripped it for support. "Legal documents guaranteeing her people's water rights. Rights you've been stealing." Clayton's face flushed red. "You dare accuse me of theft? In front of decent Christian folk, I dare speak truth before God," Dakota answered. His voice carried to every corner of the church. This girl risked her life to save her people through legal means. She trusted in justice and mercy. Are we not taught to show the same? A rustle went through the crowd. Several heads nodded slowly. "Don't let him fool you," Clayton shouted. "He's probably in league with them. Planning raids together, Uncle Dakota saved her life." Clara's clear voice rang out. She stepped away from Dakota's side, facing the congregation. "Miss Noya was hurt and freezing in our barn. He could have sent her away, but he helped her instead, because it was right." More murmurs filled the church. Mrs. Henderson stood up. Near the back, "The child speaks truth," she called. "I've known Dakota 5 years. He's a good neighbor and a God-fearing man. If he says this girl is innocent, I believe him." "As do I," added old Mr. Peterson, rising shakily to his feet. "My wagon broke down 2 days ago. Dakota and the girl stopped to help, though they were clearly in a hurry. Those ain't the actions of raiders and spies." Clayton's face twisted with rage. "You're all fools. These savages, enough." Reverend Matthews' voice cracked like thunder. The young preacher's usual nervous manner had vanished. He strode forward, Bible in hand. "Mr. Briggs, you will not use such language in this house of worship. We are all God's children here." He turned to address the congregation. "Brothers and men, sisters, consider what we do. Are we not taught to love our neighbors, to show mercy, to seek justice?" "Pretty words," Clayton sneered. "But these Indians ain't neighbors. They're threats to our way of life. Your way of life." Dakota straightened despite his pain. "You mean stealing water from those who can't fight back? Spreading lies to feed fear?" He swept his gaze across the gathered faces. "I've lived among you 5 years, worked beside you, prayed with you. In all that time, have I ever given you cause to fear me?" The silence that followed was heavy with thought. People shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. "The Apache man speaks truth," Noya said suddenly. Her clear voice, though quiet, commanded attention. "I came here believing in the goodness of people, believing that justice could be found through peaceful means." She lifted her bound hands. "Is this how you answer such faith? With ropes and false accusations?" Clara moved to stand beside her, small fingers wrapping around Noya's tied ones. The sight of the little girl holding the prisoner's hand struck many hearts. "I say we hear the full story," Mrs. Henderson called out. "Before we judge anyone," I added Mr. Peterson. "Let's see these papers properly." More voices joined in. Agreement. Clayton looked around wildly, seeing support slipping away. "You're all being deceived," he shouted. "These savages, Mr. Briggs," Reverend Matthews' tone could have frozen water. "You will sit down and be silent, or you will leave this church." The rancher's mouth worked soundlessly. His hand crumpled. The treaty papers. Dakota forced himself to stand straighter, though his vision swam. I ask only that you listen, not to me, but to your own hearts, to the teachings you claim to follow." He paused, gathering strength. "Look at this girl. Look at my niece beside her, and tell me which shows more Christian charity, mercy, or hatred." The morning sunlight streamed stronger through the windows now, touching Noya's face, Clara's bright hair, the wooden cross above the altar. The congregation sat silent, caught between old fears and newer truths. Noya stepped forward, chains clinking. "Softly, please, may I speak?" Her voice, though quiet, carried strength. Reverend Matthews nodded. "Of course, child. My people are dying," she began, her dark eyes meeting those of the townspeople. "Our wells run dry, while cattle poison what little water remains in our streams. Children cry from thirst. Last month, we lost 3 elders because the creek that sustained us for generations now flows through Mr. Briggs' ranch instead." Women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even the hardened ranch wives who'd lost kin to frontier violence couldn't ignore the humanity in Noya's words. The preacher bowed his head, shame coloring his features. "Lord, forgive us," he whispered. Boot heels suddenly echoed on wooden floors. The army officer from the fort strode in, treaty papers in hand. "This document," he announced, holding it high, "is binding by United States law." "Lies," Clayton exploded, face purpling. "All lies." "No, Mr. Briggs," the officer said firmly. "The treaty stands." Relief rippled through the congregation like a cleansing wave. Clayton's face twisted with rage. He yanked his revolver from its holster, the metal gleaming in the church's dim light. Women screamed. Children ducked behind pews. Dakota moved like a mountain, positioning himself between Clayton and the 2 people he cherished most, Noya and Clara. His broad shoulders formed a shield of flesh and bone. "Lower your weapon," the officer commanded, voice sharp as winter wind. Clayton's eyes darted wildly. "You're all blind, can't see what they'll do to us, but something unexpected happened." Jake Miller, Clayton's own hired gun, lowered his rifle to the floor. "This ain't right, boss," he muttered. "Never was." One by one, the other men stepped back. Clayton stood alone, his empire of fear crumbling like dry earth. The revolver clattered to the floorboards. Clayton fled, leaving only the echo of boot steps and shame in the silence that followed. Reverend Matthews raised his hands. "Let us pray for healing between all God's children." As Noya's chains fell away, Dakota took her hand. In that touch, he felt something new, bloom, not duty. But family golden lamplight spilled from the cabin windows, pushing back the gathering dusk. Inside, the rough-hewn table bore steaming bowls of venison stew, its rich aroma mingling with fresh-baked bread. Clara bounced in her seat, her eyes bright as she watched Noya carefully ladle portions for each of them. "Look, Uncle Dakota." Clara pointed to the wall where her beaded bracelet now hung, its colored glass catching the light. "Our family token. Right there for everyone to see." Noya's gentle smile touched her eyes. "You have given me more than shelter," she said softly to Dakota. "You gave me hope when I had none." Dakota's weathered face softened. "You brought back faith I thought was lost forever." They joined hands around the table, their prayers rising together. Apache words of blessing, Comanche gratitude, and Clara's simple "Thank you, Jesus." Outside, snow fell in gentle waves, blanketing the valley in hushed white. The cabin, so long empty of joy, now echoed with the warmth of family found. Thank you for watching. This one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.